I am Bob Salter from Geddes Consultant, representing the Scottish Planning Consultants Forum. My presentation is about development finance and assessing viability, knowing your facts and figures. This presentation explains development viability from a planner's perspective. It explains how a project's viability is assessed and the terminology used in that assessment. It highlights how the planning system and a site's location influences development viability through both development planning and development management functions. It provides examples of how issues in viability arise and how solutions can be explored. The following is a simplified methodology for assessing viability for planners. This methodology equally applies when a site is being considered for allocation in a local development plan or when an application is being determined. It has three main components: an assessment of the sales income, an understanding of this project's development costs. If you subtract the development costs from the sales income, you get the gross profit of the project. Divide the gross profit by the sales income and you generate the gross profit margin. Before we consider what is an acceptable gross profit margin, I want to explore further what the terms mean, particularly in relation to development costs. Development costs compose 5 elements, as I've summarised them. The first one is construction costs. These relate to the cost of the buildings, or the asset being considered, its servicing and its access arrangement. Abnormal costs, these are site related and the infrastructure required to deliver that site. These are costs related to infrastructure costs on drainage, the need to look at site-specific matters, and any issues with infrastructure capacity and off-site upgrades. Planning obligations. These are mainly the financial contributions required to deliver council-funded services such as schooling, local road and path upgrades, contributions towards cemetery provision and other services, normally set out by a council in its supplementary guidance. We also need to take into account the payment to the landowner or landowners, and this is usually set at the contracted price, normally explained in an option agreement. And finally, there are other costs, a variety of project expenses such as the sales and marketing costs for the delivery of the asset, legal charges and fees, planning fees, project team fees, and so on. So those are the key development costs, and I want to consider now how we can meet investors' financial targets, or at least define what those targets are. Unfortunately, there is no single universal target. Each investor will have his or her own view of what the financial returns should be. This will range from break-even for a council project, where the council is seeking to bring it in at cost, to over 30% gross profit margin for an investment in a high-risk commercial portfolio. What's important to note is that a project can make a gross profit but be inviable. This arises because the gross profit margin can be below the investor target, or in another circumstances where the project has a high investment in its development costs in its early period, and this is accompanied by a low sales income, then the project may stall financially. One thing that's available to both private sector and the planning authority is where a project is in financial difficulty, especially during its planning determination, then the district valuer can be jointly appointed to secure independent advice as to what action is needed. You may never have thought about it, but planning definitely influences sales income. Sales income from the consented asset depends on location, which sets its marketability. Marketability is, in essence, the demand for an asset, which, where demand is high, then a higher sales price will result. So, for example, allocate a site in a primary market location, such as a major town or a city. This will maximise sales income. Take the same allocation and identical proposal in a secondary location, such as a more rural town, then the outcome will be a lower sales income. When considering development plan policies, these will have an impact on development costs, the specification of materials for a new development, the requirement for new infrastructures, such as district heating. But you need to remember that all costs in a project is not necessarily matched by increased sales income. So you can create an adverse impact on a project's development viability. This equally applies to master planning requirements, because this can reduce developable area, for example, increasing open space requirements for a housing project, or as we're currently seeking to encourage more off-street car parking, this will require increased housing plot widths, which in return, if it lowers the developable area, can lower sales income. There are, however, two elements in the development costs which are less influenced by the planning system, and these are the construction costs and abnormal costs. Construction costs are essentially well known. For example, house construction costs are currently around £1,000 per square metre. If there is a viability issue, it becomes very difficult to reduce construction costs. So those construction costs tend to be fixed. Abnormal costs are always site specific, and depending on the site can lead to a major increase in a site's development costs. So for example, if a site sits on contaminated land, then there will be a substantial cost to remediate that contaminated site. If a site has been subject to past mine workings, then there may well be special grounds stabilisation works required, again increasing development costs. Even modest undulating sites will require substantial earthworks and specialist foundations, again increasing development costs. In certain locations, off-site upgrades to existing utilities and services will be required. And I think what's important to realise is sites with high abnormal costs, especially those located in secondary locations, have a low financial strength to fund high infrastructure costs. The planning system, as you will know, has direct control through planning conditions and planning obligations. Planning conditions impact on development costs by defining the timing of when infrastructure requirements are required, and may seek to introduce new infrastructure requirements, for example, electric charging points for cars. This may seem to be a good thing to do, but with increased electrical usage comes expensive reinforcement costs to the grid. We need to think carefully about, are they necessary and when is the right timing. Planning obligations are necessary to deliver essential infrastructure. This only applies if the project creates direct impacts or is part of some cumulative impact. There are 5 tests in Circular 3 of 2012, planning obligations and good neighbour agreements, which must be met. In considering the application of planning obligations, it's essential to consider whether this has been properly examined and comply with the tests in the circular. One of the things that can happen is where financial contributions are totally dependent on supplementary guidance. You should be aware that this can be unreliable if not kept up to date. And I think there's a key message to make sure that planning obligations and planning conditions are discussed and are not necessarily just imposed on a development. Development viability is a matter of understanding the issues surrounding the financial case and a willingness to negotiate the facts to come to a balanced outcome. I'd like to take a little bit of time to explain a case study, and this is about planning obligations for schooling. A house builder applied for planning permission in principle for an allocated housing site, which was a key part of the council's regeneration strategy. During the determination, the education consultation response highlighted a requirement for 3.5 million financial contribution. 2.2 million is for secondary schooling and a further 1.3 million for primary schooling. The house builder advised the planning authority that to maintain viability, the maximum financial contribution would need to be less than £1 million for all requirements, including transport and other matters. The house builder and the council agreed to jointly appoint the district valuer to advise on the project's development viability. The district valuer agreed that the proposal could only support planning obligations to a total value of £1 million. An impasse was reached. The house builder, to help provide the way forward, then carried out a school impact assessment to clarify current impacts and the mitigation required. It was understood that one of the key issues about the council's supplementary guidance was that it was based on guidance which was now 4 years old and a technical information and appraisal which was 8 years old. The school impact assessment highlighted that no financial contribution was required for secondary schooling and a 2-class extension to the local primary school was required, costing a budgeted £600,000. Agreement between the parties to this financial contribution would have delivered a viable project. The council was not willing to modify its position and the application was subsequently refused. This decision was appealed. During the appeal, the council agreed that the financial contribution required for secondary schooling was now nil, and this arose because it updated its school projections. And secondly, that a 5-class extension was required, costing £1.2 million. The reporter explored the appellant's and the council's school projection methodology, and the conclusion was reached that the council's methodology was not measuring direct impacts and therefore overstated the mitigation required. The reporter subsequently agreed that only 2 classrooms was required, but based on the council's own evidence, these could be delivered from the refurbishment of the school and this would only cost £100,000. The appeal decision meant that the project was viable and it is now progressing. This highlights the need for, whether it's school impact assessment or traffic impact assessment, that any technical appraisal needs to be kept up to date. And it's worth noting that where supplementary guidance is being used to request the financial contributions, these can be unreliable in a very quick period of time. You will realise from this presentation that maintaining viability is about leadership in seeking to reach a balanced decision. You should be aware that viability is a material consideration which can be given significant weight in an application's determination. When looking at viability, we need to consider whether the case for viability has been fully understood by both the developer and the planning authority. Has the district valuer been invited to assess project viability and provide independent advice? What measures can be and has been taken to improve the project's financial viability? And finally, have chosen mitigation measures been fully justified by service departments? Hopefully this presentation has helped develop a better understanding of this, what can be a complicated subject. The key messages are, firstly, gross profit margin is the key financial target in development viability. Know your facts and figures and you can influence its outcome. Secondly, both development planning and development management do influence viability. If you can understand the financial aspects, then better planning outcomes will follow. And finally, planning obligations need to have up-to-date technical justification to support the request for financial contributions. I hope you have found this presentation useful, and with a better understanding of development viability, it should lead to better decision making in planning.